"Get him off my stage, he's blind, he'll damage the Steinway." That was all it took. One public insult from a famous pianist, and the world almost missed a miracle. Marcus Rylan, a quiet, blind boy, mocked in front of a crowd, said nothing. In return, he simply sat at the piano, and when his fingers touched the keys, the world held its breath. What followed wasn't just music, it was a movement. This is the unforgettable story of how a boy with no sight, no fame, and no stage gave humanity something it had forgotten how to do. Listen, now before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day, and drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now let's get back to the story. Keep him away from the Steinway. This isn't a charity recital. The voice cracked through the concert hall like a whip, arrogant and sharp, slicing through the gentle hum of pre-show chatter. Gasps fluttered across the room as heads turned. At the center of it all, beneath the harsh glow of a crystal chandelier, a young boy stood motionless. He held a white cane loosely in one hand, and his other hand hovered in mid-air, just inches above the polished black surface of a grand piano. He did not flinch, he did not speak, but something in the set of his chin, delicate and steady, refused to yield. The man who had spoken, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, stepped forward. Victor Bellamy, a name etched into classical music history, the kind of performer who could silence rooms with the press of a single key. His silver hair and icy blue eyes radiated command. People bowed when he entered spaces like this. His hands were insured for millions, and now those same hands pointed down dismissively at the boy before him. "He doesn't belong on that bench," he said, half to the stage manager, half to the dozens of elite guests already seated. "He's blind. For heaven's sake, he'll damage it." "Sir," came a tentative voice from behind the curtain, "he just asked to touch the keys. He's not even scheduled to—" "I don't care," Victor barked. "You don't let a child play in traffic just because he wants to drive. Get him off my stage." The boy still hadn't moved. His eyes, milky with clouded pupils, stared somewhere just past the piano. He looked younger than he was, 14, perhaps 15, but something about his presence defied fragility. Though his body was small and slender, his hands were elegant and long, the hands of someone meant to create sound. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. His voice floated across the stage like a leaf on still water. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "No need to be dramatic," Victor replied coldly, already turning his back. "The world has enough sob stories from the wings." Someone recorded the moment. A security guard off duty, his phone halfway in his coat pocket. He hadn't meant to film, not really, but something about the boy's stillness made his thumb press record almost involuntarily. He stepped back, placing his cane in front of him again. There was no shaking in his hands, no moisture in his eyes. The hush in the room deepened, not respectful silence, but that uncomfortable, sticky quiet that follows cruelty in public. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A few whispered. Then he turned and walked away. Nobody knew his name. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Marcus Rylan had been just another invisible figure in the marble-lined corridors of Eastbrook Conservatory, the kind of place where students' surnames mattered more than their talents. Most of the students came from generational wealth, ambassadors' children, retired ballet legends, sons and daughters of global conductors. Marcus came with nothing. No mother, no father, just a plain caseworker who dropped him off at the campus gate, and a single suitcase filled with threadbare clothes, a metronome with no battery, and a half-broken Braille reader. The conservatory didn't technically admit him. He was there under a program called Silent Observer, a euphemism for keeping him far from stages or classrooms, but allowing him to soak up the inspiration. He soaked it up all right, from outside practice rooms, through doors left ajar, from vibrations in the floorboards when pianists practiced upstairs. He spent his afternoons sitting cross-legged in the hallway outside Professor Edward Alcott's lecture room, tracing music with his fingers in the air, every muscle in his hands twitching with invisible chords. It was Alcott who first noticed. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence, but one evening, as the rain poured so loudly on the conservatory's arched glass roof that even practice became impossible, he saw him sitting there, hands suspended mid-air, eyes closed, following a silent rhythm. He leaned down. "Are you mimicking my lecture?" "I was trying," Marcus said. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Alcott asked. He hesitated. "For being here." Alcott blinked. The hallway smelled of old stone and varnished wood. Thunder growled outside. "Don't be sorry. Be precise," he said. From that day forward, when his students had gone and the lights dimmed low, Alcott stayed behind. He taught him, not with printed scores, but with stories, describing the way a fugue should feel, like chasing your own shadow, or how Debussy was like water running downhill, unpredictable, fluid, free. He pressed his fingers into wood to explain the weight of a chord, tapped out syncopations on his knuckles, hummed scales into his ear until he could feel pitch without hearing it. And Marcus absorbed everything with terrifying speed, but talent in a place like Eastbrook was not enough. When the conservatory announced its young virtuoso showcase, Alcott filled out the application for him himself. He didn't list his disability. He listed his name, his skill, and a private recommendation so glowing it bordered on a prayer. He was allowed to audition. Technically, his assigned time slot was 7:45 a.m., before most faculty had even arrived. The piano he was told to use was the old, slightly out-of-tune Baby Grand in the East rehearsal wing, not the concert Steinway. A single judge came to listen. No audience, no welcome. Marcus sat in silence for a long time before placing his fingers on the keys. When he began to play, he didn't just reproduce music, he summoned it, transformed it. The piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, rose from the piano like a living thing, massive, aching, and unspeakably tender. When he was done, the judge nodded curtly and left without a word. He never received a call back, and Marcus disappeared. From the conservatory's halls, what he didn't know, what no one told him, was that someone had been watching. The janitor, who cleaned the wing every morning, had paused outside the door. He had heard what the judge heard, but unlike the judge, he was moved. That night, he uploaded the video he'd quietly taken, titled it, "Blind Boy Rejected by Conservatory. Plays Rachmaninoff by heart." The video didn't explode immediately, but a few days later, a piano blogger in Berlin reposted it. Then a music therapist in Argentina, then a retired pianist in Brooklyn. The shares tripled by the hour. Comments poured in from every continent. "She plays like he's telling his own story," one wrote. "I felt that in my chest." The conservatory board panicked, not publicly, but behind closed doors. Furious meetings were held. One particularly nervous administrator asked if they could track his IP address. Another reminded them that he didn't have an IP address. He didn't even own a phone. He was unreachable until he wasn't. An envelope arrived at the conservatory's front desk, hand-delivered, gilded edges, from the International Gala of Human Harmony, a global concert broadcast to over 60 countries. This year's theme, breaking barriers in sound. They wanted Marcus Ryland to open the show. The dean choked on his espresso. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. A spotlight had been cast, and for the first time Marcus was no longer a hidden shadow in the back hallway. He would share the same stage as Victor Bellamy himself, and Victor did not take the news well. "She'll ruin the program's integrity." His voice was low, calm, almost pleasant. Too calm, the way a winter wind can be quiet right before. "It bites." He spoke to the gala's director, an elderly man named Gerard Marot, whose career had spanned every corner of global music diplomacy. The two were standing near the edge of the stage during a pre-rehearsal walkthrough in Vienna's Grand Harmony Hall. "She's a child, blind, untrained. It's political, you know it is." Gerard raised an eyebrow. His French-accented voice carried just enough steel to remind Victor he wasn't speaking to a sycophant, and yet the world is waiting to hear him. "Or haven't you seen the numbers?" Victor exhaled sharp and slow. "This isn't a talent show." "No," Gerard replied, smiling faintly. "It's a reckoning." Somewhere across the city, Marcus Ryland stood barefoot in the quiet of his hotel suite. The floor beneath his toes was cool marble, veined like river branches, frozen in time. He tilted his head slightly as he listened to the wind against the window, then to the silence between the gusts. Even in unfamiliar cities, he mapped his world through sound. The low growl of distant traffic, the high-pitched stutter of a faulty elevator 2 floors above, the tiny, irregular tapping of a tree branch against the glass. It all fit together. Like an unspoken score, Professor Alcott had flown with him. Despite no longer holding any official title, he refused to leave his side, even when the conservatory tried to replace him with a flashy manager. "You know," he whispered during the flight, "in all my years, I never imagined I'd be flying across the world with the finest pianist I ever taught, and one the school never admitted." Marcus smiled softly. "They admitted my footsteps. That's something." He chuckled. "You always did play with the quiet kind of defiance." The rehearsal was scheduled for the following afternoon. Marcus had not yet touched the piano, not since the day he'd walked off that stage. He hadn't dared, not because of fear, but because something inside him had shifted, playing used to be his escape, his way of folding the world into melody when life refused to be kind. But now the world wanted to listen, not as background noise, not as indulgence, but as truth, and the weight of that was immense. Still, when the moment came, when the doors to the rehearsal hall opened and the spotlight swept down from the rafters like a blade of light, he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward calmly, with Alcott at his side, until his fingers brushed the edge of the piano bench. It was the same make he'd always dreamed of, a Steinway D concert grand. The finish was cold, smooth, untouched. His fingers trembled, just for a moment, then fell still, and then he sat. Every sound in the hall retreated. Even the dust seemed to pause. He placed his hands on the keys, but he didn't play. He simply held the silence in his palms, stretching it, commanding it until it bent to him, and then, with a breath so quiet it barely belonged to him, he began. Even Victor, standing near the wings, had stopped mid-sentence when the music began. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed. There was something haunting about it, something unsettling. "He's not reading from anything," he thought. "Not even muscle memory. This is pure invention. No one plays like this without being broken." First, and then it dawned on him. He wasn't broken. Marcus was the melody. It morphed. A sudden shift, minor chords now, melancholy notes rising in wounded defiance. His body leaned forward slightly, as if pulled by invisible threads. His face was serene, not joyful, not pained, just open, like a door left ajar during a storm. Then without warning he stopped mid-chord. His hands hovered. No resolution, no applause, just silence, and that silence thundered through the chamber like the aftermath of war. The rehearsal director stepped forward, stunned. "Mr. Ryland, will that be your piece for the gala?" Marcus tilted his head, considering. "No," he said, "that was just a warm-up." Victor clenched his jaw. The next day, the gala director received a request from Victor Bellamy's agent. He wanted to change the performance order. Victor no longer wished to follow Marcus's set. He wanted to open instead. The request was denied. Meanwhile, news of Marcus's rehearsal leaked. Somehow, someone had taken a short audio clip on their phone and posted it to a classical music forum. The clip, just 45 seconds long, was shared over 3 million times in 12 hours. Headlines followed: "The blind virtuoso who doesn't read music," "The boy who silenced a concert hall," "Rachmaninoff reincarnated." Victor spent the night in restless pacing, not out of jealousy, not exactly, but fear, not of Marcus, but of something deeper, of irrelevance, of watching his legacy get eclipsed. Not by time, but by a boy who played with a kind of purity he hadn't touched in decades. He hadn't played from truth in so long, he'd forgotten what it sounded like. And now, all he had was perfection. Marcus had something else. On the morning of the gala, the Grand Harmonique Hall buzzed like a beehive of silk and diamonds. Diplomats, royalty, philanthropists, critics, and composers filled every velvet seat. The orchestra tuned beneath golden archways, cameras locked in backstage. Victor warmed up alone. His fingers danced over the keys with practiced flair. Every note exact, every tempo obeyed. He didn't realize that just one room over, Marcus sat with his fingers on his lap, doing nothing but breathing, listening, mapping the resonance of the concert hall by its breathing, feeling the vibrations from the floor as the audience shuffled. And he didn't need sight. He could feel the weight of thousands. Professor Alcott stood beside him, quietly holding his cane. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. Marcus shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I've already played my hardest song. This one is just truth." Alcott smiled. "Then give it to them." Marcus nodded, then stood. A stagehand opened the side curtain. "It's time." The announcer's voice boomed across the opulent auditorium. "Please welcome to the stage, Marcus Rylan." A ripple of curiosity ran through the audience. Some leaned forward, brows raised. Others tilted their heads toward their programs, flipping pages to find the unfamiliar name. A few whispered to their neighbors. Most had never heard of him. Those who had seen the viral video from weeks before now sat motionless, anticipation bubbling under their skin like a drawn breath that couldn't be released. The house lights dimmed. A single beam of warm gold spilled down from the rafters onto the stage, illuminating the grand Steinway that stood like a monolith of sound, waiting to be awakened. And then he appeared, not in a dramatic entrance, no fanfare, no sweeping dress. Just Marcus, barefoot in a simple black gown, one hand gently resting on Professor Alcott's arm, the other loosely holding his white cane. The audience watched in reverent silence as he approached the piano, his steps slow, deliberate, but without a hint of fear. His head turned slightly as he counted the spacing. Alcott guided him gently to the bench, then stepped back into the shadows like a guardian who had fulfilled his purpose. Marcus sat for a moment. He didn't move. His hands lay in his lap and his head bowed, not in submission but in communion, like a priest before the altar or a soldier before the storm. The silence became sacred, and then, barely audible, he inhaled. His fingers rose and hovered, and they began to play. But what came wasn't a recognizable prelude. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not Bach. No one in the audience could name it because it had no name. It was something else, something older than sheet music, deeper than memory. It was a story. The right hand fluttered in ripples across the upper register, delicate notes that danced like raindrops skipping across glass. They were playful, hesitant, childlike. The left hand joined a moment later, slow and rich, anchoring the melody with the gravity of a father's absence, a mother's voice lost in time. Those in the audience who had seen hardship felt it instantly. The trembling start, the notes stumbling, searching, then suddenly finding clarity. A rising scale that soared briefly, triumphant, then collapsed again into minor keys that sounded like unanswered prayers. It was not a performance. It was remembrance. A sigh from the front row broke the air. An ambassador's wife dabbed her cheek with the corner of her glove. A young violinist in the balcony leaned so far forward that his glasses fell from his face and clattered onto the floor below. But no one shushed him. No one moved. Because now Marcus's tempo shifted. The chords thickened. His fingers struck the keys with unexpected power. Percussive bursts that thundered like fists pounding against a locked door. His entire body moved with the sound, shoulders tight, spine bowed. The rhythm became defiant, angry, alive. This was no longer just memory. It was resistance. The music seemed to cry out, "I was never given a chance. You looked past me. You shut your doors. But I am still here." Each crescendo struck like a confession. Each diminuendo left a vacuum, drawing the crowd in closer. Even Victor, watching from the green room through a live monitor, had frozen mid-step. He had one hand on the tuning keys of his own piano, but he wasn't touching them now. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes narrowed. Marcus had no sheet, no orchestra, no conductor, and yet he commanded every soul in the room like a maestro. Halfway through the piece, Marcus slowed. His left hand dropped out entirely, and with his right he began a single melody, a simple, wistful sequence in E major. It drifted upward, climbing as if trying to touch the stars. He repeated it once, twice, and then he changed it, just slightly. A single note bent downward, another skipped entirely. And suddenly those listening understood. This was his mother's lullaby. Untrained ears couldn't tell, but those with childhoods full of soft singing, of gentle rocking under moonlight, recognized it at once, and it shattered them. The notes faded. The hall was utterly still. Marcus held the final chord so lightly, it was almost a breath, then released it into nothing. No motion, no bow. He sat with his hands on his knees, facing the audience without seeing them, but knowing exactly what he'd left in their chests. And then the thunder came. Applause erupted like a dam bursting. It wasn't polite, it was primal. Chairs scraped backward. Some stood, others shouted. There were tears in places that had not known weeping in decades. The ovation rolled like a wave, sweeping the room. In a fever of awe and disbelief, cameras panned from face to face, critics, conductors, heads of state, each with expressions torn wide open. A voice cried from the balcony, "Encore." Another followed, "Marcus, Marcus!" He didn't rise, he didn't react. He simply turned his face upward toward the lights, as if listening to the sound, not with his ears, but with his skin. Backstage, Victor turned from the monitor and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. "They won't remember me tonight," he muttered. "They'll remember him." He wasn't wrong. In the hours that followed, the gala's live stream shattered viewership. Records, news outlets scrambled for a name. Social media exploded with clips, commentary, tributes. Composers posted reaction videos. Critics published emergency editorials, calling his performance a once-in-a-century expression of the human spirit. By morning, Marcus Ryland's name was the top trending search in over 20 countries, and he had no idea. In his quiet hotel room, far from the glow of fame, Marcus sat cross-legged on the carpet, his hands resting in his lap. Professor Alcott sat across from him, his cup of tea untouched. "Was it enough?" he asked softly. Alcott leaned forward, voice low and reverent. "You didn't just play music, Marcus. You changed its shape." Marcus tilted his head. "But I didn't finish the story." He smiled. "No, because now the world will be asking for more." Down the marble hallway toward him, Marcus Ryland had only just stepped into the side exit of the concert hall. The last embers of applause still echoed faintly in the air behind him. His cane tapped softly against the ground as he paused, turning his head slightly. Alcott, ever at his side, stepped forward instinctively to shield him, but the man stopped. "A few respectful feet away. My name's Anthony Liu," he said. "I'm with Deutsche Harmonia Records. We just saw your performance, and I don't even have words." Marcus nodded slowly, his fingers quietly twisting the thin silk tassel on the end of his cane. He heard the man's heartbeat in his throat. Fast, honest, not rehearsed. "I don't know what your management situation is," he stammered, "but we'd like to discuss signing you a global tour, exclusive rights to produce your first studio album. Anything you want, name it." Marcus said nothing. The wind moved faintly through the corridor's stained glass windows. Alcott raised his hand gently. "He'll speak when he's ready," and he did. But it wasn't the answer expected. "Do you know what the word prelude means?" Marcus asked softly. Anthony blinked. It means, well, the beginning, right? It means an introduction to something larger, something that hasn't happened yet." Marcus turned his head back toward the echoing auditorium behind them. "Tonight wasn't the story," he said quietly. "It was just the prelude." The man stood frozen, his business card slipping slightly in his hand, forgotten by the next. Morning, a flurry of other offers followed. Every label, every symphony, private invitations from cultural ministries, royal patrons, heads of major conservatories. Some offered money, others offered entire stages in Marcus's name. And yet, Marcus answered none of them. He sat with Professor Alcott on the train to Salzburg, where a quiet retreat awaited him. He requested a cabin with no screens, no noise-cancelling insulation, only windows that opened so he could hear the wind and the passing countryside as the landscape rolled by. He pressed his palm against the glass and whispered, "They want me to play songs I haven't lived yet." Alcott smiled faintly. "You've always played from your scars, but now maybe it's time to play from your healing." Back at the conservatory, Victor Bellamy remained behind. He had not spoken publicly since the gala. His agent issued a carefully worded statement about artistic reflection and respecting new voices in the musical world. But behind the scenes, Victor sat in the masterclass wing, watching replays of Marcus's performance on an old analog monitor, the digital buffer removed so he could rewind by feel. He didn't speak as he watched. He only listened over and over again, and each time a different note stabbed deeper. Because there were things Marcus played that he'd once understood. Before the fame, before the pressure, before the perfection, before every note had to be clean and every smile timed to curtain calls. Victor had forgotten how to bleed into the keys. Marcus hadn't. He'd never had a choice. The conservatory scrambled to rewrite its policies. Donations poured in with conditions. Create accessible programs, open blind auditions, fund scholarships for non-traditional students. What had been a hidden rot in their culture was now a cracked open wound, bleeding into the public. And Marcus, he was silent. Weeks passed. The offers kept coming. One morning, Alcott found him at a small, upright piano in the village cafe near their Salzburg retreat, playing for no one in particular. A child sat cross-legged nearby, tracing the floor tiles. With a toy car, an old man read the newspaper, not even realizing who Marcus was. He played anyway, not for applause, not for record deals, for the story. A reporter tracked him down eventually, young, persistent, respectful. She asked Marcus if she could record a short segment for a documentary. Marcus hesitated, but agreed, only if they filmed the piano, not his face. "I don't want this to be about me," he said. "I want people to hear themselves in the music." "But your story matters," the reporter insisted. "You've broken barriers." Marcus smiled gently. "No, I've just reminded people that silence doesn't mean absence." That clip alone garnered 10 million views. Among those who saw it was a teenage girl in rural Texas, deaf since birth, who had always been told music wasn't for her. After watching Marcus, she began experimenting with haptic sound gloves, mapping rhythm through touch. She sent him a letter written in Braille with the help of her sister. It ended with, "You made space for me." Marcus held the letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since the gala, he sat to compose again. The new piece came to him, not in a storm, but in a whisper. It began with a simple phrase. 3 notes, no more, repeated with minor variation. He built around it slowly, layering. Intervals like vines curling around a trellis. This time it was not sorrowful, nor angry, nor desperate. It was thankful. When he played it for Alcott, he closed his eyes halfway through and turned his face away, not to hide tears, but to honor the moment. "You've written a bridge," he said softly. When Marcus finished, he looked puzzled. "A bridge between who you were and who you've become." He titled the piece Sightlines. It was played for the first time in a modest chamber hall in Paris, not announced in advance, just a quiet performance for 100 guests. No live stream, no press, just sound, and those who were lucky enough to be there never forgot it. They said, "It felt like finding a path in the dark and realizing you had known the way all along. Mr. Rylan, are you aware you've just been nominated for the Artisan Prize?" The voice on the phone was jittery with excitement, like it had been waiting hours for this moment. Marcus sat quietly in the corner of a sun-drenched garden in Florence, his cane laid across his lap like a sleeping bird. Bees danced lazily through the lavender, the breeze rustling the hem of his dress as if it too wanted his attention. He didn't answer right away. The word prize always felt like a foreign thing to him, as if it were meant for other people, people with medals in glass cases, framed degrees, or families who saved front-row seats at their recital. "I've never competed," he said gently. "Not really. It's not a competition," the voice replied. "It's recognition." Marcus tilted his head, listening to the distant bells of a cathedral strike the hour. His fingers ran along the braille, etching on the notebook beside him, a collection of half-finished melodies scattered like rain. His answer came, not as a declaration, but a murmur. "Then let the music speak. That's all I've ever wanted." News of the nomination made headlines within hours. The Artisan Prize, given only once a decade to a musician whose work fundamentally reshaped the human understanding of sound, had never before been offered to someone so young, nor to someone blind, nor to someone who had never formally graduated from a conservatory. But none of that mattered anymore, because the world had already begun to change. In his echo, children in forgotten neighborhoods were being handed keyboards by volunteers instead of plastic guns. Entire orchestras reviewed their audition processes. Braille sheet music requests surged globally. Music schools, once cold to difference, now scrambled to embrace it. He never asked for this. He never sought to be a symbol. But he was becoming one anyway. Meanwhile, back in Eastbrook, the hallways that had once hummed with silent judgment now carried a different tone. Professor Alcott had returned, this time not as a lecturer, but as the newly appointed Director of Inclusive Curriculum. It was a title no one had imagined a year ago, and one the board had been practically shamed into creating after alumni and donors pulled support. But Alcott didn't care how it came about. He cared only that the door once slammed in Marcus's face was finally open for others like him. On the door to his new office hung a simple plaque for the students who listen in silence. "We hear you now." And Victor, he stayed behind long after the rest had moved on. He performed less, traveled even less, but something in him had shifted, quiet and gradual, like ice melting beneath spring soil. He began composing again, not for an audience, but for himself, not flawless, sweeping symphonies, but raw, intimate pieces, sometimes only a few minutes long, and everyone began the same way, with silence. Then a single note, just like Marcus had taught him. One morning, Victor surprised the faculty by requesting to audit a class, not to teach, but to learn. He sat in the back row of a beginner's improvisation course, surrounded by students 3 generations younger than him. Scribbling rhythms in a worn notebook, Victor Bellamy admitted to the class one day, "I never learned how to feel my way through music, only how to dominate it. But I've met someone who listens better than I ever did." The students listened, and in them, Victor heard something he hadn't in years: grace. Half a world away, Marcus Ryland stood on the shoreline of a quiet bay in Nova Scotia, where the waves whispered secrets in rhythms only he seemed to understand. He didn't tour. He didn't chase venues. Instead, he traveled like a wind that chose its own direction. Small town to city, chapel to community center, leaving behind fragments of music like footsteps in the sand. He was never alone. Word spread long before his arrival. People didn't come just to hear him play. They came to hear him listen. Sometimes he didn't play at all. Sometimes he invited others to sit at the piano with him, children, elders, those too afraid to touch the keys. He'd guide their hands gently, and together they'd create something no one had written before. He called it shared sound. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being heard. In one such session, a boy with a stutter sat trembling beside him, afraid to touch the keys. "I'll ruin it," he whispered. Marcus smiled. "There's nothing here to ruin, only to reveal." He played a single note, then another. By the end of that afternoon, he'd composed a 4-bar melody that would go on to be featured in a youth mental health campaign. When asked later why he thought Marcus had chosen him, the boy answered simply, "He saw me without ever seeing me." Letters came by the hundreds, from mothers, from ex-musicians, from inmates, from school teachers. Many ended with the same line, "You reminded me I was still music." Marcus never responded with words. He responded with compositions, each handwritten, each built from a line in the letter, each returned without fanfare. A mother who lost her child to cancer received a piece titled "The Breath You Left Behind." An ex-convict who found solace in rhythm received forgiven tempo. A man with dementia who could no longer recall his wife's name was sent "The Forgotten Heart She Kept." He kept no record of these pieces. No copies. They belonged only to the people who wrote to him. He believed music was a gift, not a transaction, and still he refused interviews, awards, talk shows, or spotlights. But his absence only made his presence more mythic. The Artisan Prize ceremony approached. It would be held at the Royal Hall in London, a room carved of gold and ghostlight, echoing with the footsteps of centuries of greats. It was to be broadcast to 94 countries. A marble podium flanked by velvet banners waited at center stage. The chair reserved for Marcus Rylan remained respectfully empty for most of the evening, until minutes before the final presentation. The back doors creaked open. He entered, not with a team, not with guards, just with Professor Alcott, a violin case in one hand, his cane in the other. He did not walk straight to the stage. He walked to the side and sat among the audience. When they called his name, applause rose in a tidal wave. He stood slowly and bowed, not to accept the prize, but to honor the people in the room who had lived quietly, fought gently, and never been heard. And then he spoke into a single microphone. "I have no speech," he said, "but I brought a voice." He opened the violin case and pulled out a simple wooden flute. It had belonged to his mother, and as he raised it to his lips, the room held its breath, and then he played, a melody without ego, without polish, just breath, just truth. And in that truth, the world was silenced again. The first note rose like mist, soft, delicate, ancient. It curled into the rafters of the Royal Hall, finding its way into corners that even chandeliers had forgotten. The audience sat frozen, not from reverence but from something more sacred, recognition. This wasn't just a song. It was an arrival, the sound of something unburied, a whisper from the soul's edge. Marcus stood alone, the wooden flute steady in his hands. His eyes closed, not from blindness, but from devotion. Each breath he gave into the instrument carried stories no words had ever held. He played not like a performer, but like a witness, someone who had stood in silence for years and finally found the breath to speak. The melody was simple, yet it wandered, a question that answered itself, a yearning stretched into sound. People forgot to blink, to breathe. Some wept without realizing it. Others held the hands of strangers. The piece lasted just under 5 minutes, and when it ended, he lowered the flute slowly, as if not to disturb the silence it had created. He bowed his head and left the stage. No speech, no declaration, not even a glance toward the award, still gleaming untouched on the velvet-covered pedestal. It didn't matter. The room rose around him, a standing ovation, born not of protocol, but of something wordless and primal. Even the most jaded critics didn't dare open their mouths. For once, silence was enough. Outside, the night hung heavy and blue, like a velvet curtain draped across the city. Marcus Rylan walked with Professor Alcott down a narrow, cobbled street, lit only by the occasional gas lamp. His cane clicked softly with each step, echoing off old stone buildings that had heard centuries of secrets. They asked again, "Will you accept the award?" Alcott said gently. Marcus tilted his head. "Does music need a medal to matter?" He smiled. "No, but sometimes the world needs a mirror to see what it's become." Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward a low wrought-iron fence, behind which lay a tiny park, bare trees silhouetted in the moonlight, a single bench beneath an archway of ivy. "Can we sit?" he asked. They did. He placed the flute across his lap and lifted his face toward the night. "I played that song for her," he said at last. Alcott knew who he meant. He didn't interrupt. "I remember her hum more than her words. She used to sing while folding laundry or brushing my hair, little half melodies that never resolved. I never knew the names of them. I don't think They had names. He listened. I used to think I lost her when I lost my sight, that the colors faded first, and then her voice. Marcus turned slightly, hands folding over the flute, but maybe I was just waiting for the right silence. One, where I could hear her again. Alcott rested his hand on Marcus's. You gave her a second life tonight. They sat like that for a long time, the cold brushing their cheeks like a memory. The next morning, Marcus's performance made headlines around the globe. But this time, the stories didn't focus on his blindness or the tragedy of his childhood or the accolades. They focused on something else, a stillness, a reminder. One headline read, he played 5 minutes. The world stopped for 10. Another, the note that taught us to listen again. And another, no lights, no fireworks, just breath, just truth. He had not accepted the Artisan Prize, but the foundation that awarded it made an unprecedented decision. They renamed the award itself. Henceforth, it would be called the Marcus Rylan Honor, not as a prize, but as a promise to hear what the world once refused to listen to. Months passed. Marcus vanished from the public eye again, retreating into a rhythm of quiet villages, handwritten compositions, and soft teaching moments. He never posted, never advertised, but he was never forgotten. One winter morning, in a small mountain town nestled in the Pyrenees, he was found at the community library teaching a 7-year-old boy with autism how to feel music through vibrations. In his feet, he lined small brass bowls with sand, taught him to strike them gently, then press his soles to the wood floor and wait. He didn't speak, but when Marcus played beside him, he smiled. Later that day, the boy took his hand and tapped out his own melody on Marcus's palm. He played it back instantly. The boy laughed, and it was the first time his mother had heard him laugh in months. Marcus never mentioned it, but a teacher from that town wrote about it in a small blog post, which quietly went viral. The subject line read, "She never told us who she was, but she left behind music that made the snow feel warmer in places she never visited." Murals appeared, not of his face, but of his hands outstretched, playing invisible notes on school walls, subway stations, refugee tents. People had begun using his compositions to process grief, to celebrate healing, to bridge silence where words had failed. And slowly, a new phrase emerged in the lexicon of music education: play like Marcus. It didn't mean perfection. It meant presence, it meant truth, it meant listening so deeply that the music wasn't something you played, it was something you remembered. Back at Eastbrook Conservatory, a new wing was under construction. Glass. Walls, natural acoustics, accessible from every direction. It would be called the Rylan Wing for sonic exploration. But the only words etched into the entrance would be his. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything, waiting to be heard. One day, years later, a young girl wandered into a quiet corner of a music library in Lisbon. She was blind, like Marcus had been, and carried a recorder she'd made from an old garden hose and a rusted flute mouthpiece. She wasn't famous, she wasn't known, but tucked into the sleeve of one of the archive's braille scores, she found a slip of paper. It was a handwritten melody, no name, no date, just 7 notes. She played them and began to cry, not because it was sad, but because someone, somewhere, had left her a voice. And in that moment, she knew Marcus had passed by, and the world still echoed with his breath. The sun hovered low over the horizon, brushing the sea with the kind of amber light that made the world seem hushed. In a weather-worn coastal village in northern Iceland, tucked between black cliffs and windswept grass, Marcus sat in the back room of a local cafe. His hands rested over the rim of a piano older than the cafe itself. The keys stuck in places, some were yellowed, others chipped, but it sang. And that, he once said, was enough. A dozen people gathered around, no cameras, no announcements. They had come, not because of who he was, but because of what they had heard. A fisherman's daughter said she once heard a song that made her father cry for the first time since her mother died. A woman who worked in the bakery across the street brought warm bread, not as payment but as reverence. The door stayed open, the cold air rolling in and out with the tides. Marcus didn't introduce himself. He asked each person, "What sound reminds you of home?" Some said the crackle of firewood, others the hum of old fridges. One man smiled and said the silence of snow before it lands. He nodded, and without speaking further, he played. He took their sounds and gave them shape. He built music from memory, not his, but theirs. He bent the notes to carry their weight. His left hand struck a pattern like a hearth's heartbeat. His right, a rolling echo like snow melting on tin rooftops. People didn't clap. They breathed. After the final note faded, he reached for the bread with both hands. His smile was quiet and complete, and the villagers would tell the story for years after, not about a famous pianist, but about a boy who came, asked about home, and turned their answers into sound. Meanwhile, in cities Marcus would never return to, the legacy of his silence deepened. Universities began developing courses, not in composition, but in listening. Programs popped up for invisible musicians, those with no traditional training, those who played on borrowed instruments, those who used rhythm to survive rather than perform. In the Bronx, a subway violinist named Camille was invited to speak at the World Music Symposium after citing Marcus as the reason he finally recorded his first album. "I thought music needed to be loud to matter," he said to the crowd of thousands. "But Marcus showed me you could whisper and still move mountains." A dome made of broken wind chimes and rainwater pipes. After hearing Marcus Ryland's story, a woman called it a house for forgotten sound. When asked if she'd ever met Marcus, she shook her head and replied, "No one meets him. You feel him." And deep within the Amazon, in a village untouched by modern orchestras, but not untouched by pain, an elder strung vines across hollowed logs and began teaching rhythm to children orphaned by conflict. He named the rhythm Ryland Pulse. The world was no longer merely echoing his name, it was reshaping around his silence, yet Marcus remained unaware of most of it. He didn't carry a phone. He didn't read the articles. He didn't follow his influence like a shadow. He followed music and let the rest follow him. In late autumn, he traveled to Kyoto, staying in a monastery that echoed with bells and the rustle of bamboo. The monk said he arrived during the softest rain they had ever heard. He never asked for shelter, only for a quiet place to hear his own thoughts. Each day he walked the temple gardens barefoot, leaves gathering between his toes, the gravel crunching beneath each step like memory. In the evenings, he played for the monks, not with flair, but with reverence. He used the sound of the wind through paper walls, the drip of water and stone basins, the creak of century-old floorboards, and turned them into symphonies of stillness. One monk, nearly blind himself, wept as Marcus played. "I never believed I'd hear someone speak in the language I dream in," he whispered. They gave him a small bell as a gift when he left. It made almost no sound, just a faint shimmer when moved, like a ghost brushing wind chimes. He wore it on his wrist from then on. Back in Eastbrook, the conservatory had changed beyond recognition. Once the symbol of silent elitism, it was now a sanctuary of rediscovery. A new generation of students flooded in, not to compete, but to create, not to perform, but to tell the truth. A freshman named Elijah, who had once been mute from trauma, now composed for the entire student orchestra. A girl who had grown up. Without books, taught advanced rhythm using only her feet. Their motto hung above the grand staircase. "Music is not what we play, it's what we allow ourselves to feel." And in a glass case near the entrance, untouched, gleamed the very flute Marcus had played the night of the Artisan Prize, donated anonymously with a note beneath it. Let someone else borrow the voice. For a while. Spring morning, years after that night in London, Marcus returned to the city, not for a concert, but for a child. A little girl named Luma, 6 years old, blind since birth, diagnosed with an auditory disorder that made traditional music unbearable, too loud, too sharp, too violent. Her parents had written to every music therapist they could find. Most said the same thing. Maybe music just isn't for her. But then one therapist, old and quiet, said, "There's someone who might know how to help. She doesn't answer phones. She doesn't live anywhere. But if you write your story into music, she may come." So they did. A melody, just 4 notes, sent by post. And one morning, Marcus arrived. He didn't knock. He sat outside their door on the steps, flute in hand, and began to play, not outward, but inward, into the cracks of the stone, into the breath of the home, into the silence where Luma sat curled in her room, hands over her ears. And slowly Luma removed her hands, stepped out 1 foot at a time, and sat beside the man who didn't speak, didn't explain, just played. A melody built for her, shaped by her, designed not to overwhelm but to embrace. Luma cried, then touched the flute, then laughed. And a new song was born, one that no one but the 2 of them would ever understand. Years later, when Luma became a sound artist known for crafting immersive musical gardens, she would say, "I never learned to love music. I learned that music already loved me. He taught me that." And still, Marcus moved quietly through the world, not seeking monuments, not chasing legacy, but leaving behind footsteps of sound too soft to notice unless you were listening with your soul. And those who truly listened, who really listened, began to notice the places he'd been, like fingerprints pressed into wind. A library in Peru, where no book had words, only tones. A bridge in Italy that sang when walked across barefoot. A music box in a Ghanaian orphanage that played different songs depending on who opened it. He was never there for the unveiling, but the music always knew. It always carried his breath, his touch, his truth. And so the boy who was once mocked by a famous pianist, who was told he'd never touch a Steinway, never play for a real audience, didn't just silence the world. He taught it to listen. The wind moved gently through the hollow of the desert, brushing across the cracked earth like the whisper of a forgotten name. Somewhere far from cities, in a land of red sand and distant horizon, Marcus sat beneath the open sky, with his back resting against the sun-warmed stone. No stage, no audience, just silence as endless and wide as the stars preparing to rise. He had come here without telling anyone. No train schedule, no festival invitation, only a letter he had received months earlier. A letter written by a boy from the DNA nation who had carved his words into the back of a broken drumhead. It said, "There's a sound here we've forgotten how to listen for. Can you help us remember?" Marcus carried no instrument, only the bell around his wrist and the shape of his words echoing inside him. By evening the village gathered. They came barefoot, wrapped in woven shawls, led by grandmothers who had once sung lullabies to the wind. There were no chairs, no microphone, only the crackle of a small fire and the hush of expectation, waiting to become song. Marcus stood, slowly, and faced them, not by sight but by sound. He could hear the difference in how each person breathed, who shifted, who held still. He could hear the nervous foot-tapping of the boy who'd written to him, his heart stuttering like a skipped beat. He knelt and pressed his palms into the ground. The people waited. Marcus didn't speak. Instead, he began to hum, a low, steady tone. No words, no melody, just breath. Then one by one, others joined in. An elder drummed softly with a carved stick. A girl rattled a necklace of shells. Someone began tapping 2 stones together, slow at first, then faster. The desert, ancient and wide, seemed to listen too. And in that moment the people remembered. They remembered that music didn't come from radios or polished halls or written scores. It came from them, from stories carried in bones, from the ache in their ancestors' silence, from laughter shared beside dying fires, from the rhythm of walking the same earth generation after generation. Marcus had come to give them music, but in truth he had only come to remind them they already had it. When the night was over, the boy approached him. He held the broken drumhead in both hands, trembling slightly. "It doesn't make sound anymore," he said. Marcus took it gently and traced the edges with his fingers. "Then maybe it remembers silence better than any of us," he said. The boy looked at him wide-eyed. "Can I learn to make it sing again?" Marcus nodded, smiling, not with sound but with story. And he left him with the only word he needed: begin. The next day he was gone, no goodbye, just echoes. As the years rolled on, Marcus's name became less a name and more a feeling. In academic journals, his influence was studied, not through his compositions, but through the ripple effect of them. Music therapists called it the Rylan shift, a movement from perfection to presence, a way of playing that placed emotion before execution. In war zones, humanitarian workers used his melodies to reach children who had forgotten how to speak. In elderly homes, memory care specialists found that even patients deep in dementia recognized his songs, tapping along with their fingertips, as if the music had always been a part of them, waiting in some quiet room of the mind. And in courtrooms, his story was used as a case study in disability advocacy, showing the power of opportunity versus exclusion. One lawyer famously quoted him during a civil rights hearing, "You don't need to see to be a mirror. You only need to reflect the truth." But Marcus never returned to those conversations. He didn't read the articles. He didn't sit for documentaries. When an international committee tried to award him a Lifetime Achievement honor, he declined. With a note written in faint ink on handmade paper, "Lifetime doesn't mean end. I'm still listening." Stories like these began to spread in a way no PR campaign ever could, not because they were printed, but because they were lived. If you asked 10 people where they last heard Marcus Rylan, you'd hear 10 different cities, 10 different sounds. In Rio, he played spoons on a food stall counter. In Cairo, he taught blind children to map notes with their feet. In Alaska, he played to glaciers that answered back with their cracks. Each place changed him, and each place he changed in return. But not once did he take credit. He only listened, then played, then left. As the years passed, his hair silvered, his steps slowed, but his presence grew brighter, like the final glow of coals before dawn. And then one day, he stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply sat in a village garden in Laos, placed his cane beside him, and told a little girl who had been following him with wide, curious eyes, "It's your turn now." The girl asked to do what? To hear. And when the girl asked what she should listen for, Marcus placed his hand over the child's chest and whispered, "Start here." That night, Marcus played his final piece. No audience, no cameras, just the wind, the crickets, and a river bending through the trees. It was not grand. It was not loud. It was the sound of a life arriving at peace. And when the sun rose, Marcus was gone, not mourned, but remembered, in breath, in stillness, in every place where music once waited for permission and now flowed freely. The man who was once mocked for daring to touch the piano, the boy who played without sight but saw what no one else could, the soul who turned silence into sanctuary, didn't just change the world. He retuned it, and it still sings in his tea. The piano sat untouched in the corner of the orphanage's common room, its once polished frame dulled by years of tiny fingerprints and sun-faded memories. No one played it anymore. The tuning had gone, and a few black keys stuck, refusing to rise after being pressed. Children used it more as a hiding place than a home for music. Until the day a stranger walked in wearing dust-worn shoes, a linen shawl around his shoulders, and a single silver bell around his wrist. He said nothing at first, just placed his hand gently on the piano lid and smiled. The children watched from a distance, wide-eyed and skeptical. But when he slid onto the bench, his presence drew them. In like the slow unfolding of morning, his fingers didn't strike the keys. They hovered, waited, listened. And then, without ceremony or flair, he played. The melody was soft, familiar to no one and yet known to everyone. It had no name. It wasn't bold or impressive. It was simply kind, like the first hand you ever held, like the hush of a lullaby you couldn't remember until now. The children crept closer. Some sat cross-legged on the tile, others leaned against door frames. He never asked their names. He didn't need to. He had always known how to listen before he spoke. That would be the final recorded sighting of Marcus Rylan. No passports, no tickets, no destination, just music left behind like footprints in water. No announcement followed, no memorial service, no obituary, only a silence that fell across the world like snow. And into that silence came echoes, not of his name, but of his voice. Because his music was still everywhere, in the waiting rooms of hospitals, where mothers held premature babies to their chests and whispered lullabies based on the five-note theme he once played for grief. In subway tunnels, where violinists began their sets, not with Bach or Mozart, but with simple improvised melodies, music that didn't ask for applause, only for presence. In classrooms where blind students felt rhythm, not through pages, but through movement and memory, because Marcus had shown the world that sound didn't need to be seen to be understood. In nursing homes where therapists used vibrations and silence to soothe the trembling hands of the elderly. In cities, villages, and corners of the earth, untouched by wealth, but overflowing with spirit, people began saying his name not as a legend, but as a gesture. A woman in Palestine named her daughter after him. A monk in Bhutan composed a chant, using only the rhythms of breath, calling it the Rylan chant. In the streets of Harlem, a mural appeared, not of his face, but of a single ear surrounded by swirling colors, painted by children who had only ever heard his story. The caption beneath it read, "Listen deeper." At Eastbrook Conservatory, now utterly transformed, the Rylan wing opened its doors to a new generation. It welcomed students with no formal training, no reading ability, no traditional language. It accepted applications submitted through humming, tapping, and even silence. In the center of its atrium stood no statue, just a grand piano surrounded by empty chairs. Visitors were encouraged not to watch, but to sit, to join, to remember that music was never meant to be distant. And on the wall behind the piano, engraved in stone, were the final words he had once whispered to a girl who didn't know how to begin. "If you can hear it, it already belongs to you." One day, a young student named Noir, blind since birth, walked into that space holding her mother's hand. She had never touched a piano before, never believed she could, but she had read a story about a boy who once sat in hallways and listened through walls. She approached the keys slowly, tracing them, trembling, and played a note, just one. But the sound that followed didn't come from the piano. It came from every person who heard her. It came from within, and though Noir never knew it, she had begun her own story that day, because that's what Marcus Rylan had left the world. Not just a legacy, not just compositions, but permission. Permission to play without perfection, to hear without judgment, to create without apology, to exist in all the broken, beautiful, untrained messiness of being human and still call it music. In a distant canyon, where the wind still curls through hollow stone, if you sit long enough, you might hear a soft echo, not a voice, not a song, just a resonance, a presence. As if someone once sat there, played, listened, and left behind a silence that sings. That's where he is now, not gone, just everywhere we choose to listen. And the next time you hear a child hum to themselves beneath the noise of the world, or an old man tap a beat onto his coffee cup when no one's watching, or you catch yourself breathing in rhythm without knowing why, stop, be still, and remember the blind boy they once mocked, who played one note and silenced the world. He never sought fame, never demanded recognition, never fought for a stage, yet Marcus Rylan transformed the world, one silent note at a time. Stories like these began to spread in a way no PR campaign ever could, not because they were printed, but because they were lived. If you asked 10 people where they last heard Marcus Rylan, you'd hear 10 different cities, 10 different sounds. In Rio, he played spoons on a food stall counter. In Cairo, he taught blind children to map notes with their feet. In Alaska, he played to glaciers that answered back with their cracks. Each place changed him, and each place he changed in return. But not once did he take credit. He only listened, then played, then left. As the years passed, his hair silvered, his steps slowed, but his presence grew brighter, like the final glow of coals before dawn. And then one day he stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically. He simply sat in a village garden in Laos, placed his cane beside him, and told a little girl who had been following him with wide, curious eyes, "It's your turn now." The girl asked, "To do what?" "To hear." And when the girl asked what she should listen for, Marcus placed his hand over the child's chest and whispered, "Start here." That night, Marcus played his final piece. No audience, no cameras, just the wind, the crickets, and a river bending through the trees. It was not grand. It was not loud. It was the sound of a life arriving at peace. And when the sun rose, Marcus was gone, not mourned, but remembered, in breath, in stillness, in every place where music once waited for permission and now flowed freely. The man who was once mocked for daring to touch the piano, the boy who played without sight but saw what no one else could, the soul who turned silence into sanctuary, didn't just change the world. He retuned it, and it still sings in his tea. The piano sat untouched in the corner of the orphanage's common room, its once polished frame dulled by years of tiny fingerprints and sun-faded memories. No one played it anymore. The tuning had gone, and a few black keys stuck, refusing to rise after being pressed. Children used it more as a hiding place than a home for music, until the day a stranger walked in wearing dust-worn shoes, a linen shawl around his shoulders, and a single silver bell around his wrist. He said nothing at first, just placed his hand gently on the piano lid and smiled. The children watched from a distance, wide-eyed and skeptical, but when he slid onto the bench, his presence drew them. In like the slow unfolding of morning, his fingers didn't strike the keys. They hovered, waited, listened. And then, without ceremony or flair, he played. The melody was soft, familiar to no one and yet known to everyone. It had no name. It wasn't bold or impressive. It was simply kind, like the first hand you ever held, like the hush of a lullaby you couldn't remember until now. The children crept closer. Some sat cross-legged on the tile, others leaned against doorframes. He never asked their names. He didn't need to. He had always known how to listen before he spoke. That would be the final recorded sighting of Marcus Rylan. No passports, no tickets, no destination, just music left behind like footprints in water. No announcement followed, no memorial service, no obituary. Only a silence that fell across the world like snow. And into that silence came echoes, not of his name, but of his voice. Because his music was still everywhere, in the waiting rooms of hospitals where mothers held premature babies to their chests and whispered lullabies based on the five-note theme he once played for grief. In subway tunnels where violinists began their sets, not with Bach or Mozart, but with simple improvised melodies, music that didn't ask for applause, only for presence. In classrooms where blind students felt rhythm, not through pages but through movement and memory, because Marcus had shown the world that sound didn't need to be seen to be understood. In nursing homes where therapists used vibrations and silence to soothe the trembling hands of the elderly. In cities, villages, and corners of the earth, untouched by wealth but overflowing with spirit, people began saying his name, not as a legend, but as a gesture. A woman in Palestine named her daughter after him. A monk in Bhutan composed a chant using only the rhythms of breath, calling it the Rylan chant. In the streets of Harlem, a mural appeared, not of his face, but of a single ear surrounded by swirling colors painted by children who had only ever heard his story. The caption beneath it read, "Listen deeper." At Eastbrook Conservatory, now utterly transformed, the Rylan wing opened its doors to a new generation. It welcomed students with no formal training, no reading ability, no traditional language. It accepted applications submitted through humming, tapping, and even silence. In the center of its atrium stood no statue, just a grand piano surrounded by empty chairs. Visitors were encouraged not to watch, but to sit, to join, to remember that music was never meant to be distant. And on the wall behind the piano, engraved in stone, were the final words he had once whispered to a girl who didn't know how to begin. If you can hear it, it already belongs to you. One day, a young student named Noir, blind since birth, walked into that space, holding her mother's hand. She had never touched a piano before, never believed she could. But she had read a story about a boy who once sat in hallways and listened, through walls. She approached the keys slowly, tracing them, trembling, and played a note, just one. But the sound that followed didn't come from the piano. It came from every person who heard her. It came from within. And though Noir never knew it, she had begun her own story that day. Because that's what Marcus Rylan had left the world. Not just a legacy, not just compositions, but permission. Permission to play without perfection, to hear without judgment, to create without apology. To exist in all the broken, beautiful, untrained messiness of being human and still call it music. In a distant canyon where the wind still curls through hollow stone, if you sit long enough, you might hear a soft echo, not a voice, not a song, just a resonance, a presence. As if someone once sat there, played, listened, and left behind a silence that sings. That's where he is now, not gone, just everywhere we choose to listen. And the next time you hear a child hum to themselves beneath the noise of the world, or an old man tap a beat onto his coffee cup when no one's watching, or you catch yourself breathing in rhythm without knowing why, stop, be still, and remember the blind boy they once mocked, who played one note and silenced the world. He never sought fame, never demanded recognition, never fought for a stage, yet Marcus Rylan transformed the world, one silent note at a time.